Feast and Ritual. Why New Orleans is known for Voodoo. Quote, June 24th, St. John's Day, was formerly observed very generally in this city by the Creole population. On St. John's Eve, it was customary for large parties to resort to the old lake end and to other favored spots, and the next day was regarded as a holiday. It was also the occasion chosen by the Voodoos for the celebration of their barbarous rites. This tribe of fetish worshippers seems to have nearly disappeared. Now and then isolated instances of voodooism are brought to light, but the sect no longer exists as an organized body. Unquote. 2 years before Marie Laveau died, the Times-Picayune declared Voodoo dead. A few years later, in 1896, the Times-Democrat began a June 26 article with the line, quote, Voodoo is not dead in New Orleans, unquote. Curious onlookers have known New Orleans for the voodoo secrets for centuries. But New Orleans is not the only place where these traditions took root. Another result of the transatlantic slave trade, the religion has other names and other homes in the United States, as well as the Caribbean, South America, and its homeland of Africa. So why is New Orleans, in particular, known for the tradition colloquially known as Voodoo in New Orleans, or the Yoruba religion? Before we continue, a note on terms. For simplicity and search engine optimization, I have used the colloquial term voodoo to describe the religion. However, this is not the term that would be used by some who worship in the tradition. The sources I use tend to use different terms, but most use voodoo, and I follow their lead. I recently completed a continuing education course at Loyola University about the history of New Orleans voodoo. I grew up in the Catholic tradition and only had knowledge of the disinformation around voodoo as a result. The similarities between the rituals I learned as a child and ways of worship that I learned in my class about the voodoo tradition were initially startling to me. I was dipped in the propaganda, taught that it was evil or magic or witchcraft, and did not try to understand beyond that. But it is a religion that is older than Christianity, and it's monotheistic. Much like the saints in Catholicism, there are lesser beings who are greater than human, who intercede between humans and God. Also, like Christianity, there are contradictions in the oral tradition and many sects, so there is not one explanation or set of rituals among all who worship. Further, it is traditionally a closed religion, meaning full participation requires initiation, just like Catholicism, so some of the intricacies of the religion are guarded secrets. One of the most important feast days in the Voodoo tradition is St. John's Eve on June 23rd, and it is celebrated publicly. We have accounts of St. John's Eve voodoo rituals in the newspaper starting in 1869. While it has faded at various points, we still have public ceremonies to this day. St. John's Eve has been celebrated for millennia in Europe. The tradition was originally midsummer, or the summer solstice, and celebrated the longest day of the year, with all-night bonfires and drunken dancing. In Northern Europe, the sun would not set on this day. St. John's Eve, June 23rd, falls so close to the summer solstice, like Christmas and the winter solstice, the older pagan tradition was hijacked and given new meaning, retaining the all-night drunken bonfire tradition, but now celebrating the birth of St. John the Baptist. Also, like Christmas, this feast celebrates the birth, not the death, of the Holy One. When Europeans arrived in New Orleans, they brought their religion with them and mandated it. Catholicism was the religion of the colony through both the French and Spanish regime, required by the Code Noir, making New Orleans and Louisiana unique in what would become the United States. The Protestantism of the Northeast and most of the rest of the South would not permeate the barrier created by the French and Spanish, with Catholic symbolism and culture remaining the predominant culture in southern Louisiana to this day. St. John's Day was celebrated by the Creoles before the Voodoo tradition began. According to a Times-Picayune article from 1879, quote, on St. John's Eve it was customary for large parties to resort to the old lake end and other favored spots, and the next day was regarded as a holiday, unquote. Like St. Joseph's Day was adopted by black basking Indians to hide their rituals, possibly among the celebrating Italians, St. John's Day was adopted for voodoo rituals. The Creoles received the tradition from their French and Spanish ancestors. The Feast of St. John is still widely celebrated in some places in France and Quebec and Spain and, of course, New Orleans. It is said to be the most important holiday in Barcelona, and all-night dancing and bonfires are always part of the tradition. When enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to New Orleans, no one could take their religion from them either. Older than Christianity, the tradition we now call Voodoo originated in West Africa, is monotheistic, and is more of a way of life for those who worship than a religion that you practice once a week. The spirit world is integral to daily life in the tradition, and everything they do is influenced by their spirituality. While the Europeans did not understand it or try to, they did not initially outlaw it. Everyone had to be Catholic, including the people they enslaved, but everyone also had Sundays off. Our African ancestors began a tradition of practicing their own religion in Congo Square on Sundays after attending Mass. When fear of revolt spread because of the successful revolt in Haiti and Louisiana's German Coast Uprising of 1811, the Americans outlawed any gathering of enslaved Africans, and as a result, the religious rituals were no longer possible in the city. The symbolism of the voodoo religion was absorbed into the symbolism of Catholicism to hide their spirituality while continuing to practice their own traditions. While voodoo itself was never outlawed, many aspects of it, including gathering, drums, horns, dancing, fortune-telling, and healing, were outlawed between 1786 and 1896. This mixture of religions, hidden and practiced in secret, became known to some as New Orleans Voodoo, and has been misinterpreted for hundreds of years. Much of what I learned about the voodoo traditions in the past was based on assumptions. In looking through the old newspaper records for St. John's Eve references, several discuss the European customs around the holiday. Their descriptions of the European customs aren't dissimilar to the descriptions of the voodoo celebrations of St. John's Eve. Perhaps there is another instance of Europeans applying their own traditions to what they saw and making assumptions. St. John's Eve is the most important holy day in New Orleans Voodoo, and several reasons bubble up about why. In A New Orleans Voodoo Priestess, Carolyn Morrow Long explains, quote, "At some undetermined time, St. John's Eve was adopted by people of African descent and became the most important celebration of the Voodoo liturgical calendar. The custom might have been brought to Louisiana by Voodoo devotees from Saint-Domingue. There, the feast of St. John the Baptist, a patron of Freemasonry, who is treated as a minor Loa, is observed with bonfires and ceremonies by Freemasons and Voodoo societies," unquote. Long also quotes Oscar Felix from the Louisiana Writers Project interviews, who explained, quote, "They celebrated St. John's Day because they wanted to be like him. He was a great man and always did what was right," unquote. Mr. Felix's explanation of the ceremony is very much like a Catholic Mass, which he pointed out in his interview. In the Voodoo Encyclopedia, Jeffrey E. Anderson explains, quote, "The degree to which the religion depended on European models for St. John's Eve, and the extent to which pre-existing African practices attach themselves to a similar European holy day, is open for debate," unquote. St. John's Eve ceremonies were commonly reported in the newspapers in the 1870s. Long notes that the death of Marie Laveau in 1881 caused a decrease in the interest in the Voodoo traditions, and the Creoles began celebrating the 4th of July instead of St. John's Eve with the Americans. Quote, "The Roman Catholic holiday sacred to the Creoles was being replaced by that uniquely American midsummer commemoration, the 4th of July," unquote. The Creoles assimilated their traditional celebrations with their new American identity. The modern public St. John's Eve rituals probably have very little relation to the actual rituals and ceremonies performed by the initiated. For instance, The past descriptions explain that the rituals happened out by the lake, and today they happen much closer to the city. Any printed interpretation is clouded by assumptions, bias, and commercialization. Speaking of commercialization, in 2024, the ritual will be in a hotel. Any actual ritual probably would have been in secret in the 19th century. However, there were plenty of people performing rituals as spectacle in the 19th century, which journalists and individuals witnessed, just like today. In her book, Long explains, quote, "These orgy stories tell us more about mainstream attitudes toward race than about voodoo, but they occasionally contain descriptions that, although imperfectly understood by their writers, are surprisingly accurate," unquote. One does wonder what Long is using as a litmus to determine authenticity. One frequent criticism of contemporary celebrations is that the participants seem to be largely of European descent, not African descent. This is an interesting modern criticism considering that the old descriptions of St. John's Eve from the 19th century made specific mention of the mixed races of the celebrants. Further, the mixing of races often made it hard to tell who was of what ancestry, which is possibly also true today. New Orleans voodoo is a uniquely African-American religion that experienced persecution to the point of becoming a secret religion. Does the participation of largely light-skinned people make the practice more acceptable? Is it okay that it takes white skin to make a tradition acceptable? Some historians point to knowledge of enslaved children who looked white spreading as a catalyst for more abolitionist movements, as in, it took white people seeing enslaved people who looked just like their children to realize how atrocious the practice was. During the gay rights movement, and even today, it takes brothers and aunts and cousins coming out to change the minds of some people about who deserves rights. Is this the lesson of the modern voodoo spectacle? Or is it simple appropriation? According to Denise Alvarado in The Magic of Marie Laveau, Embracing the Spiritual Legacy of the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, one criticism that Marie Laveau sometimes gets from voodooisants is that she commercialized the religion. The voodoo rituals witnessed by reporters in the 19th and 20th centuries were likely commercialized ceremonies meant to draw crowds and make money. It may be prudent to look at who benefits monetarily from any modern public rituals as well. However, in his work, Dr. Cody Roberts explores the stigma of voodoo as fraud. In his article, The Secret and Irreligious Doctrine of Voodooism, Institutionalization versus Cultural Stigma in New Orleans Civil Court, he writes, quote, "Local papers had a history of reporting on voodoo as fraud and economically motivated crime," unquote. Why does the commercialization of voodoo make it fraud while the Catholic Church owned billions and continues to raise more? Perhaps my skepticism of the local public practitioners stems from this deep stigma. Dr. Roberts also explains that practitioners had workarounds for the plague of the criminal stigma. Quote, "After 1920, some practitioners founded Christian-style religious organizations called spiritual churches, frequently establishing charters for their organizations. Unlike their more isolated predecessors who were frequently content to practice voodoo out of their homes, those professional practitioners, or workers as they were often called, that founded churches generally believed that charters that established those institutions proved more effective in shielding them from law enforcement," unquote. While many will claim that New Orleans voodoo is extinct and anyone claiming to follow the voodoo tradition in New Orleans is practicing Haitian voodoo, spiritual churches still exist openly in New Orleans. My ideas about why New Orleans became known for these ceremonies, even though they were practiced by many cultures and by others in the United States, builds on other theories, as the answer lies in all aspects of New Orleans history. I'm sure this is only scratching the surface, but this is my theory so far. First, some things about New Orleans are not unique, including the existence of a voodoo tradition. Europeans brought enslaved Africans as some of the first people of the city starting in 1719, and they brought their spirituality with them. That, in particular, is not unique to New Orleans, but we don't get New Orleans voodoo without the transatlantic slave trade. Next, Louisiana was a Catholic colony through both the French and Spanish regimes. The symbolism of Catholicism is easily substituted for some of the symbolism in the Voodoo tradition, and the doctrines are compatible. For instance, Catholicism relies on chanting and incense and elaborate rituals, while Protestant Christians typically avoid ceremony and symbolism. But this is not unique to Louisiana either. Other Catholic colonies like Haiti or Missouri also have a persistent connection to the occult. While St. Louis has a substantial inland port, neither Haiti nor Missouri are major international ports like New Orleans. Lots of tourists pass through gawking, reporting their experiences around the world, and they have for centuries. But other major ports like South Carolina also have a connection to the Voodoo tradition and the Gullah people. So what is different in New Orleans? First, after the Haitian Revolution, free people and enslaved people from Saint-Domingue sought refuge in other places, and they too brought their spirituality with them. This is where New Orleans starts to diverge from other places. Most of the Haitian refugees, up to 90%, came to New Orleans. Another nuance of New Orleans is that the city was particularly deadly. According to Death Data and Denial in Antebellum New Orleans by Catherine Olivarius, in 1851, quote, New Orleans had a mortality rate of over 5.5% per year, more than double the national mortality average and far higher than the official number promulgated by the city's Board of Health, unquote. It's always been easy to die in New Orleans. Knowledge of herbs and natural medicines is also a major part of the Voodoo tradition, and the enslaved Africans brought this knowledge with them. They were always surrounded by death and seeking cures for their diseases. Further, Creole mourning customs were elaborate and lasted a full year. The family they spent their lives with suddenly became ancestors who they wanted to pray to or even talk to on the other side. And the spirit realm is integral to the Voodoo tradition. It's easy to imagine grieving wives wanting to ask their deceased husbands one last question, or daughters who lost their mothers wanting to say I love you one more time. And Voodoo offers this opportunity to commune with the spirit world. Next, the Code Noir required everyone to be Catholic, but it also gave Sundays off and allowed enslaved people to buy their freedom. Sundays off allowed gatherings in Congo Square, also known as Place Publique. Buying their freedom created a system in New Orleans with a third caste, free people of color. From the beginning of the colony, there were free people of African descent in Louisiana, and New Orleans had the largest and most prosperous population of free people of color. While we have rules, they've always been loosely enforced. Further, the Creole mixing of cultures made it very difficult to distinguish who was of African descent after only a few generations, and the apparent freedom with which the enslaved people in the city operated made it difficult to distinguish free from enslaved. This fact startled and terrified many visitors who reported seeing enslaved people moving with freedom and interacting with other enslaved people and free people. Additionally, the rugged individualism of America is celebrated the most in New Orleans, making obscure or ostracized traditions prominent. I don't think this one needs further explanation if you've ever wandered the streets of New Orleans. New Orleans geography played a role as well. Bayou St. John is a sacred site for pilgrimages in the Voodoo tradition. In the video, Was Marie Laveau a Voodoo Queen? Legend versus Reality, linked in the description. Priest Roby Gilmore, who was one of the guest speakers in my New Orleans Voodoo history class, explains that Bayou St. John is where salt and fresh water meet. The two deities of these waters also meet in New Orleans, so Bayou St. John is also integral to the history of New Orleans as a cradle for the religion of Voodoo. Worshippers come from around the world to the sacred location of Bayou St. John. In her book, Alvarado agrees that Bayou St. John is sacred. She explains that a wishing spot was located there, as well as the St. John's Eve ceremonies. In the Voodoo Encyclopedia, Bayou St. John is explained as the location where ceremonies like St. John's Eve and Sundays in Congo Square were moved after they were effectively outlawed in the city through restrictions on gathering, dancing, drums, and herbal medicine. Finally, New Orleans is a matriarchal culture. The Ursulines arrived in 1727 to establish a hospital and educate the girls. In The Feminine Face of Afro-Catholicism in New Orleans, 1727 through 1852, Virginia Meacham Gould explains, quote, New Orleans was unique among circum-Caribbean settlements of Catholic colonial powers in that its primary missionaries were not male priests but Ursuline nuns, members of an order dedicated to advancing Catholicism through an aggressive program of female catechesis, unquote. Some of the first religious leaders to arrive in the colony were women sent to educate other women. In addition to the Ursulines, free women of color became matriarchs in their families as more women were able to purchase their freedom because they were cheaper. Also, 10% of the population of the Orleans Territory was free people of color, according to the first American census in 1810. The 1795 New Orleans census showed that free women of color owned more property than white women and free men of color, 143 houses compared to 127 houses for white women and 40 houses for free men of color. Women of all cultures have always had a place of authority in New Orleans. In the Voodoo Encyclopedia, Anderson points out that most of the leaders depicted in the accounts of voodoo rituals were women. Quote, another aspect of St. John's Eve that warrants further research is the official capacity of the queens who presided over the ceremonies. Since the early 20th century, writers have referred to any female voodoo priestess as a queen. During the 19th century, the title appears to have been more specific, designating the priestess who act as a mistress of each St. John's Eve ceremony, unquote. European women, African women, and women who were born of many cultures were all respected leaders in their communities in New Orleans. To sum it up, New Orleans was a Catholic city, and New Orleans was the deadliest of all southern cities, with the largest and most prosperous population of free people of color. The swamp is a place of decay, and the Creoles participated in elaborate death and mourning rituals. The symbolism of Catholicism is similar to that of the Voodoo religion, and was used by them when their religion was effectively outlawed. 90% of the Haitian refugees came to New Orleans after the Revolution, adding their culture to the mix. New Orleans celebrated and celebrates individuality, and the mixing of cultures made it difficult to readily tell who belonged to what culture. To this day, no one will look twice at a band of Marie Antoinettes or skeletons or even Mrs. Rompers on any random Tuesday. The unique geography of New Orleans provided an easy retreat to hide and sacred waters for rituals. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, New Orleans is a matriarchy with women of all cultures leading, prospering, and reigning since the very beginnings of the colony. The Ursulines paved the way for the prosperity and control of free women of color who provided an easier acceptance for the queens of voodoo. These are the reasons I've gathered so far on why I think New Orleans is known for the religion of voodoo. Let me know your thoughts on why New Orleans is known for voodoo. I hope you have a rejuvenating St. John's Eve now and always. Please like and subscribe for more from the deep coming soon.